experiments, and we showed that if we put music, essentially, into these electromagnetic coils, that we could accelerate the way that people healed. What does this have to do with wavelengths of light in lobster blood? Is there any possible connection? So the immediate thing that we notice is that if we start with a 432 based tuning, and then we double the number, we're going up in octaves. So here's what I did. I took 432, and you continue to double it. And you can also put this into a online calculator for converting frequency over to wavelength. So there's a number of ways to make this calculation, but basically you can convert a musical note over to a wavelength of light. So that's what I did here. And we end up with 400, when you do the calculation, you end up with 432 hertz, equal to approximately 631 nanometers. Now, I'll tell you why that's interesting. It's interesting because in the scientific literature, 630 nanometer light is one of the wavelengths of light that's used to turn on mitochondrial function. And 440 hertz is not. All musical instruments should be tuned to 432 hertz because it is harmonic with the human body. It actually promotes energy and healing. Alternatively, we can use 630 nanometer light to turn on mitochondrial function. But we're still going to, if we do that, we're still going to be stimulating the outside of the body. And the patches are still superior in this sense because we can turn on specific peptides in the body that you can't with normal light. But this is a very powerful piece of information. So let's take a look at this. So we go back to our lobster data, and now we have 550 nanometers is one wavelength of light that's coming off of lobster blood. 630 nanometers, we took that number based off of 432 hertz tuning because that's what we were using in our experiments. And my hypothesis was that 630 nanometer light is in the lobster, we just didn't detect it in the lobster blood. So I had that hypothesis. And then the other wavelength of light was somewhere on the chart, it would be somewhere between 700 and 709 nanometers, roughly. Those are the wavelengths we were working with. So this was my first invention that came off this process. I call it a biophotonic reflector and ended up getting several patents on this. And if you look inside this device, you'll see that we have a series of optical filters, very high precision optical filters, along with an optical grade mirror. So essentially, we take the light, the naturally occurring biophoton emissions from the human body, they pass through the filters, hit the mirror, and then come back to the human body, but only specific wavelengths of light stimulate the surface of the skin. So that was the idea behind this. Let's see if we could treat the surface of the skin with the same wavelengths of light that are responsible for keeping lobsters young. Did that make sense? Okay, that was the objective. We got 2 to 3 years of age reversal in 10 minutes. And the way we measured this was through looking at the cell capacitance, the size of the cells. So a measure of how cells age is in their size. As we age, the cells will begin to shrink. And the electrical charge of the cell will start to become smaller. It's one of the mechanisms that's not well known about how a healthy cell goes and becomes cancerous tissue, and how ultimately cancer can be treated naturally. But that's a different subject.
Yes,
So we can correlate aging to the electrical charge around the cell. So when you use this device, the cells expand, cells become younger. But it's almost too rapid. So we wanted to look for other methods here. Now let's go back to this idea that we can use technology to create new forms of matter. Maybe we could take some of those experiments that we did and apply it to this new knowledge that we have. If we were going to create new matter, what would we do? Hydrogen, as it turns out, has a metallic state. So of course we're familiar with hydrogen and water, but if we just take hydrogen, of course it's a gas, we can compress hydrogen and turn it into a liquid, and of course that's a cryogenic material. But what's not well known is that hydrogen can actually exist as a metal. So if we go back to these experiments and we say, okay, we took different types of metal. We took bismuth, copper, tin, aluminum, antimony. We put them into the presence of oxygen, exposed them to light and these electromagnetic fields, and we created new matter. What if we could take water and we could break it into hydrogen and oxygen, treat hydrogen like a metal, recombine the hydrogen and oxygen in the presence of a catalyst using a specific type of energy, and reassemble it into a new form of water that never existed before? That was the hypothesis. So if we could achieve this, what it would literally mean is that if we could do it, we could create a new type of water that had photons of light embedded into the bonds of the water, so that when you drank the water, it would release that light into the body. That was the goal here. And that's how we got from where we started to where we are now in this presentation. So I built this machine that was it was a great Tony Stark moment for me. It was maybe about 3 feet wide and about 9 feet long. And we started getting drops of water coming out of this thing. And it was incredible to see it for the first time. But it was so slow, it was so painful. But we did it. So everyone knows what ice looks like. Here's a beaker of distilled water where we freeze it. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take this new water and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to freeze it. So why do we want to freeze it? Well, it's a phase change. Another hypothesis here is that as water goes from being a liquid to a solid, in chemistry that's a phase change. So can we see whether or not the light in the water is going to be released when the water changes state? Because that would represent a change in the bond angle, so it would make sense to me that the light would be released during that process. And that would be a really great thing, because it would mean that once the water gets into the body, the water will phase change and release the light. So let's see what happens. We started freezing it, and we started to notice these highly coherent threads of water crystals. So this was important because we know that if you were to have a structured water, the water is highly organized. So we start to see some evidence here. And, sorry, I skipped ahead one. Okay, now we're good. When the water freezes completely, really interesting things happen. We get a vortex funnel that occurs at the center of the beaker. And of course, we associate vortexes with natural energy and living systems. If you look at the beaker from underneath, again, you can see this implosion that occurs as the water crystals move towards the center. as compared to the control. As you change the wavelengths of light that we use to treat the water, different shapes start to appear, living shapes start to appear. In some samples, they resemble an egg. And what do we think about eggs? Eggs are life. And depending on the type of water that we use and the treatment and the amount of treatment time, we get an increase in the density of the number of water threads. So what this means is that we can control how much light is in the water through the settings. You probably would like to see this now, right? Okay. We're going to watch now a time-lapse video that we took. What we did in our lab was we took a freezer. Okay, we're going to play it, so just watch it. We have our freezer, and it has a glass front. We have a time-lapse camera. So you're seeing this water sample being frozen over a period of about 4 or 5 hours. So normal ice on the left, and there's our nice vortex funnel and implosion of water on the right. Okay, what do you think? And then sometimes really weird things will happen when we're playing with the settings on the machine. Sometimes we will get these pylons that will rise out of the water, and we get all different types of shapes. My daughter Kelly, who's in our lab, this is her project. She's done a phenomenal job on these experiments, and she calls this a strawberry. So she's making strawberries out of ice in the lab. So now that we have created a new form of water, the question is, and by the way, this is patented already. This was a very quick patent for us. So we'll have just filed another 4 patents on this. We'll have over 20 patents on this technology by the time we're done. So we need to be able to determine if there's any benefits from drinking this water. Now we've created this new form of water, never existed before. Now we want to know if there's any longevity benefits. But what happened next, I think, was even more incredible. We had created this new water, never existed before. We did it from using a piece of equipment that has only been around since the 1950s, spectrophotometry. So prior to the 1950s, there would have been no way to figure out what wavelengths of light lobsters were emitting, which was fundamental to this discovery. What I found, though, what I didn't expect, is that the same codes, the same living codes that I used to create this technology were found in a book from 5,000 years ago. The key to this discovery was already in the Bible. Let's go to the video.
You know that if you find an Indian arrowhead in a cave, archaeologists will immediately say, oh, intelligence has been here. They carved this Indian arrowhead. But then you point to DNA, which is the most complex information system, language system in the entire universe that makes up our chromosomes, our genes, all the information that builds a human or a dog or a cat or whatever. And secular scientists will say, oh, chance, chance, chance. You know what DNA is? It's like a complex information system. You see, life is built on information. Do you know how much information there is in living systems on this planet? It's not billions, it's not trillions, it's actually zillions of bits of information. And you know what? You've got to have a language to read the information. Do you know DNA not only has an incredible amount of information in it, but it also has the information to make a language to read the information. If you're going to read a book and it's in Russian, you need to know the Russian code or language or you can't read it.
Actually, the word mathematics did not mean the science of quantity until Aristotle. At Plato's time and before that, mathematics just meant learning. That's why the word polymath just means many, poly, learning. So it was synonymous with all learning because mathematics was just the language of all learning. You know, another thing people don't realize is this was an age, Greeks didn't have numbers like we have. They used letters to describe their numbers. So the letter alpha was the number 1. The letter, beta was the number 2. And this was true also in Hebrew, in Phoenician, all the ancient languages. They were all using their letters to represent their numbers. It wasn't until we had the benefit of having the Arabs come up with the Arabic numeral system, right? And we got all the numbers that we currently have. But when you think about that, that means that all of the things that were written had both a literary meaning and a mathematical meaning. And this is there's a whole study of this that people have long ignored, which is called gematria, right? And so there are hidden codes within the Bible that people that study this stuff swear by because they can find these hidden codes inside of it because that's the way it was written in the first place.
Okay. So let's take a look at this. And if we're going to look in the Bible, let's start right in the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. So, what information could possibly be there where we could learn something new that isn't already self-evident? Well, there is, as it turns out, more information there in this one simple sentence than we might normally think. So let's look at it. First of all, in the beginning. We can think of this as representing the concept of time. Past, present, future. God created the heaven. Well, heaven is kind of everything around us. That's space, length, width, and height. And the earth, that represents matter, solid, liquid, gas, plasma. So here in this first sentence, we have the very foundation of everything around us. And actually, this is quite consistent with how we might think of the start of everything. So in other words, God is outside of normal space and time. There's this event called the Big Bang, if that's how everything really began, and then all matter and everything around us came from that. And in this one sentence, all those concepts are there. But let's dig a little bit further. So we're going to look at the book of Genesis in the Hebrew, because we can convert Hebrew over to a numerical code. We can convert the letters over into numbers, and we can convert the words over into numbers. So if we were to look at, in the beginning, God created the heaven and earth, in Hebrew, this is what we would see. And we see something very interesting. There's 7 words here, and there's going to be 3 words to the left of center, 3 words to the right of center. That center word can't really be translated into English, not completely. So we have 5 letters to the left and right of center, and the second words have 3 letters. Okay, that's a little interesting. Let's take a look at this another way and use the numerical values. First, let's go back one slide, because actually there was something here I wanted to show you that wasn't here. We can look at this as being a ratio. 3 words out of 7, or 7 words and then 3. 3, 7, 7, 3. Those numbers mirror one another. Oops. Try that again. Okay. So we're going to convert these letters and words over into numbers now, and this is what it's going to look like. So far, they just look like numbers and nothing really much more about that. Oh, there's our 3773. My mistake. Okay, so we got these 7 words total, 3 on the left, 3 on the right. Now, let's just start someplace and let's add all of these numbers together. We come up with 2,701. Okay, so far, nothing really remarkable about that. Apparently, however, 2071 is 37 times 73. 3773. And I want you to remember that 3773 because later on it's going to become very important because it was foundational to a discovery I made. 37 happens to be the 12th prime number. 73 is the 21st prime number. 1221. Those numbers mirror one another. Maybe there's something about that that we're supposed to pay attention to. Now let's have a little bit of fun with this and start to combine some of the different words. What might we find? Well, let's take God, the earth, and the heaven as a concept and add those numbers together. We get the number 777. Interesting? Does it mean anything? Now let's say God and the heaven. That equals 888. Now let's take in the beginning God. And as you might expect, that is 999. So we start to see a pattern begin to form. As an inventor, I'm always looking for patterns. I'm looking for patterns in nature because those patterns are not there by accident. There has to be a meaning behind it. So if the Bible is indeed the inspired word of God, then what you would expect from a being that created everything is that God would have to be the ultimate scientist, physicist, inventor, creator, and that God would put a mathematical code into the Bible for people to discover so we could believe. But maybe it's also an instruction manual. What about that? So I looked at these numbers and I thought, let's go back and look at 3773 again. So 777 is 37 times 7 times 3. That's kind of interesting. 888 is 37 times 8 times 3. And 999, 37 times 3 times 3 times 3. This is starting to not look like a coincidence. And these numerical codes are only the beginning, because you see these numerical codes throughout the Bible. But what does this have to do with lobster blood? Is there any connection there? So we go back to these wavelengths of light. What we had already seen was that 550 nanometers, 630 nanometers, and 700 to 710 nanometers, when we created this biophotonic reflector, we found it was capable of, at least in part, reversing part of human aging. So we have in the book of Genesis the story of creation, the story of human beings, and then ultimately the fall of man. So you might expect, if there's a mathematical code in the Bible, in the story of creation, we might find that same mathematical code in nature. But you can see that these numbers are not the same as 777, 888, 999. So on the surface, well, there doesn't seem to be a pattern there. But wait, 3773. What if instead of that just describing the number of words and the way those words are arranged in the book of Genesis, what if it's a ratio? What if what God is trying to tell us is you need to look at the ratio of these numbers? So that's what I did. Let's take a look at that. There's our biblical code. There's our lobster code. 777 divided by 888 is 0.875. 999 divided by 888 is 1.125. So we're going to take 631 nanometers at the center over here on our wavelengths, multiply it by 0.875, and we find about 550 nanometers. When we're working with light, if we're within 3 to 5 nanometers of a target, it's considered relevant. And when we're looking at spectrophotometry data, that is about the tolerance that we work with. We take 631, multiply it by 1.125, and there is our 710 nanometers. So the implication to this is pretty extraordinary. It shows that there is a mathematical sequence of numbers that aren't there, that's arbitrary. And this ratio, same ratio, can be found in living systems. Or Spock would say, it literally is Genesis. Okay. What movie was that from? Anybody know? Star Trek what? Which Star Trek movie? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? Star Trek 2. Come on. I know my friend Matt over here knows the answer. He's just not saying anything. Okay.